This is our research project about time spent with media and racial biases. The researchers for this project were Lauren Harkins, Lexi Brown, and Meredith DeCoste.
Social media is a major part of people's lives. It consumes most of our time, which leaves us vulnerable to being exposed to biases within the media through negative stereotypes. News sources can reinforce stereotypes of people of color because they show disproportionate amounts of stories that criminalize people of color. People resort to these stereotypes because they are so readily available in common news sources and media. The amount of time someone spends engaging with media sources will have an effect on participants' implicit racial biases due to the negative overrepresentation of Black Americans. The news source include Fox, CNN, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter, and Apple News. There were 38 participants that were Westfield State University students aged 18 to 24 of a variety of racial and gender identities. The participants completed a multi-part survey after completing a consent form. The first part of the survey included demographic questions such as age, gender, race, education, and more. The next part included questions about media consumption, news platform type, and time spent on various sources. Finally, the participants were instructed to take the implicit association test on race. Participants were shown pictures of people's faces as well as different descriptive words and had to assign the faces and words to either the European American or African American category. These questions were used to help determine the participants' racial biases based on a scale, with the lowest score being a strong preference to European Americans over African Americans. The higher score represents a strong preference to African Americans over European Americans. A linear regression was run to see where there may have been significant correlations between variables. Correlations were then run between IIT scores and three other variables: news source, time spent on news source, and age, because they related to the hypothesis, and that is where significance was found.
For all the graphs, the IIT scores were coded as shown in the first table. The first graph then shows the y-axis being the IIT score and the x-axis being time spent on media sources in minutes. The slope of the line shows the positive correlation between IIT score and time spent on news sources, meaning that as IIT scores increased, the time spent on media also increased. Although there is a positive correlation, there is no significance of the correlation for this set of data. For our second graph, the news sources were coded with Twitter and CNN being 1 and 2 as they show more liberal views, and Fox and Facebook were 6 and 7 as they show more conservative views, with the other media sources mentioned before mixed in the middle. The IIT coding was the same as before and is shown on the y-axis. The x-axis shows the news sources. The slope of the line shows a positive correlation, meaning that as the news sources get more conservative, people's implicit biases score rose also. However, there was no significance to this data set. For our final graph, we looked at age and IIT score. The y-axis was participants' IIT score again, while the x-axis was participants' age. The slope of the line shows a negative correlation with significance, meaning that as people get older, they start to have a higher preference for European Americans compared to African Americans, which matched previous research in this field.
Results of the study show no significant relationship between different media sources and participants reported using reported IIT scores. There was no significant relationship between time spent engaging with media and participants' IIT scores. A significant negative relationship was found between participants' age and their reported IIT scores, meaning that the older the participant, the higher the level of implicit biases toward Black people. The finding of the relationship between age and IIT scores was not surprising, as other studies have reported similar findings of negative correlations between age and attitudes about race. A study in Australia shows that older people have had levels of higher intolerance in minorities, especially towards Muslims and indigenous people. One of the limitations of this study was the lack of diversity among participants. The lack of educational diversity in this study may have had an effect on the results because research indicates that people who receive more education show less intolerance for people of color than those who have received less education. For this study were to be conducted again, future research should ensure that participants come from all different racial, ethnic, and educational backgrounds, also include a large number of participants of different ages.
We would like to thank all the participants for providing us with the data that allowed us to study this topic. We would also like to thank Professor Manella, Sombrowski, Hugh Zhang, and Hafner for emailing their students to participate.